In January 2025, the United States once again entered a new cycle of sweeping change. Donald Trump, in a controversial yet fervent re-election, wasted no time in reviving a strategy he once hailed as the lever to make America great again, a trade war. But this time, it wasn't just angry tweets or stern warnings. It came in the form of executive orders signed within the very first week of his second term. And the targets weren't limited to China like in years past. This time, the blow extended to longtime allies: Canada, Mexico, South Korea, and Europe. A 25% tariff on cars and auto parts from Canada and Mexico, 30% on steel from Brazil, and most symbolically, a thunderous statement, a 100% tariff on all electric vehicles imported from China. There was no more beating around the bush. We cannot allow our enemies to dominate the future of American transportation. President Trump declared to the media in a solemn White House setting, with a row of Tesla and Ford EVs behind him, and a few BYD models shrouded under black tarps as if to signal a declaration of war. Beijing wasted no time in striking back. Within 48 hours, China retaliated with tariffs as high as 75% on American goods, focusing particularly on agricultural products and high-tech consumer goods. But they didn't stop there. In a more calculated move, China tightened exports of strategic materials, gallium, germanium, and rare earths, the very lifeblood of the global supply chain for semiconductors, batteries, and tech devices. The world was thrown into disarray. Stock markets went red, logistics costs surged, and millions of businesses scrambled to reassess their supply contracts. But what worried analysts most wasn't just the numbers, it was the nature of this confrontation. This wasn't merely a trade dispute. It was a race for control over value chains, a battle for technological autonomy, and, on a deeper level, a brutal stress test for the global economic order that had stood since the end of World War II nearly 80 years ago. The battle lines no longer clearly separated friends from foes. Countries that had been close trade partners now found themselves as collateral damage in an escalating tariff war. And while governments debated economic sovereignty, entire industries began to feel the squeeze. One of the first and hardest hit sectors was the auto industry. Once celebrated as a symbol of regional integration and cross-border manufacturing among the US, Canada, and Mexico, it now stood as the first casualty of protectionist policy. And like a chain reaction, when a car couldn't be completed due to missing parts from a neighboring country, it wasn't just the factory that came to a halt. The entire supply chain, from transporters to dealerships to consumer finance banks, began to wobble. What seemed like a tariff aimed at foreigners was, in fact, triggering an undercurrent within America itself, where every car now carried not just an engine, but a flood of questions about jobs, prices, and the survival of an entire industry. And that's when the real story began. When cars couldn't roll off the assembly line, when major automakers struggled with painful decisions, relocate factories, renegotiate deals, or accept massive losses, when American consumers were suddenly staring at a market more expensive, more limited, and more uncertain than ever before. A crisis no longer confined to trade negotiations, but embedded in every single car on the road. When American consumers walked into a Ford or General Motors dealership in early spring 2025, they didn't just see sticker prices skyrocketing, they could feel that something had broken. The models once proudly advertised as under $30,000 had vanished from the showroom floor. New cars were scarce, used cars were more expensive, and financing options were tightening as banks began factoring in the growing risks facing an industry under siege. For decades, North America's auto industry had been a symbol of cross-border cooperation. A car sold in Michigan might have an engine assembled in Canada, a transmission from Mexico, and an electronic dashboard made in China. That was the spirit of NAFTA, then USMCA, and an era when borders weren't barriers but bridges in modern manufacturing. But now, everything has flipped. The 25% tariff wasn't just a number, it was a cold, hard warning that the old world was over. American automakers like Ford, GM, and Stellantis found themselves stuck in a painful dilemma. If they continued importing parts from Canada and Mexico, they'd face high tariffs and struggle to compete with Chinese domestic brands in Asian markets. If they moved production back to the US, costs would skyrocket, timelines would stretch, and supply chain risks would grow. But if they did nothing, they'd watch their market share shrink, consumer trust erode, and future investments lose their footing. While CEOs held closed-door meetings in Detroit, smaller suppliers began to sense something ominous closing in. Shifts were cut, contracts delayed, and thousands of workers were first placed on paid leave, only to be laid off entirely when orders failed to return. A missing bolt, a delayed circuit board, just one weak link could halt the entire assembly line. And in the auto world, where every day of delay means mountains of cost, that delay was fast becoming the new normal. The crisis didn't stop there. When cars couldn't roll off the line, it wasn't just the automakers who suffered. Banks, dealerships, and logistics networks all felt the squeeze. Auto loans dropped sharply, used car prices spiked, and distribution centers ran short on vehicles to ship. Consumers were left with two choices: pay 1.5 times more for a car or wait endlessly in a market plagued by shortages. Then, just as automakers began looking toward electric vehicles as a strategic escape, they ran headfirst into another invisible wall, another war brewing quietly, but just as dangerous: the shadow war over semiconductors, rare minerals, and the raw materials controlled by only a few nations. Shifting to EVs seemed like the solution, but with every battery, every chip, every control board came another link in a global supply chain. And when China began restricting exports of materials like gallium and germanium, elements invisible to most yet essential to all modern electronics, the entire electric vehicle roadmap began to shake. If the trade war was a storm on the surface, the semiconductor and rare metal battlefield was the icy undercurrent, quiet but far more perilous. A war without gunfire, yet powerful enough to paralyze modern manufacturing. And once again, the world was reminded, technological self-sufficiency is no longer a slogan, it's survival. While traditional cars were breaking down due to missing parts, a quieter crisis was creeping into every circuit board, every tiny chip that the modern world depends on. It was a shadow war, where semiconductors and rare metals became strategic weapons, where even a single milligram of material could decide the fate of an entire industry. The US raised tariffs on semiconductor imports from China to 50 cents, not just to reduce dependency, but to force corporations to reinvest domestically. But that strategy quickly met a cold and calculated response. China announced export restrictions on gallium and germanium, two elements that may sound obscure, but are core ingredients in the production of semiconductors, batteries, and advanced military equipment. Western tech leaders dubbed it a strike at their Achilles heel, because even a small disruption in the supply chain could paralyze the entire global system. For years, Beijing had quietly invested in controlling rare earth mines and refining capacity around the world. Nearly 80% of rare earths are processed in China, and a significant share of the world's gallium, antimony, and graphite supply lies in Chinese hands. Back in 2021, when China first hinted at restricting rare earths, the world was alarmed. Now, that alarm had become reality. Chip makers in Japan, South Korea, Europe, and even the US began receiving delay notices, followed by cancellations. Production lines for laptops, smartphones, satellites, and even military radars were being hit one after another. The consequences didn't come overnight, but when they arrived, no one was spared. Car launches were delayed due to missing sensors. New smartphones couldn't be produced in volume. Industrial computers missed delivery windows, stalling major defense projects. And most critically, the green industries, where lithium batteries, solar panels, and energy storage systems require massive quantities of these materials, now faced a clouded, uncertain future. Alternatives do exist, from Vietnam, Australia, Brazil, even parts of Africa. But developing mines, refining capabilities, and new transport routes would take at least 3 to 5 years, billions of dollars in investment, and immense political risk. Meanwhile, the world doesn't have that kind of time. All of this forces a reckoning. Can a global economy built on efficiency and cost optimization survive when power is concentrated in the hands of a few countries controlling raw materials? And does free trade still hold any meaning when every strategic resource becomes a bargaining chip? It's against this backdrop that a new battlefield begins to take shape, no longer just over chips or sensors, but over an entire sector poised to define the future: electric vehicles. From city streets to rural roads, from the US to Asia, from consumers to governments, Everyone had placed their hopes on a green transition. But right at that pivotal moment, EVs became the next target in the escalating trade war. And from there, a new chapter began, one in which Tesla, Rivian, BYD, and the entire global transportation industry stepped into a conflict not just over products, but over who will own the future. Amid the whirlwind of broken supply chains and a tech market starved for components, electric vehicles emerged as both a symbol of hope and of uncertainty. The US government had once pinned its vision on a green era, where EVs would anchor the energy transition, where ordinary Americans could drive zero-emission cars at affordable prices, and where the US would reclaim leadership in next-generation transportation. But that dream quickly began to blur when Donald Trump unexpectedly struck with a 100% tariff on all electric vehicles imported from China. On paper, it was a direct blow aimed at BYD, NIO, and a host of rapidly rising Chinese EV brands. These cars weren't just cheaper, they were becoming competitors in battery tech, driving range, and charging infrastructure. To the Trump administration, this was a matter of survival for American manufacturing, and a chance to shield Tesla, Rivian, and other domestic makers from being outcompeted on their own turf. But the problem was this: eliminating Chinese EVs didn't mean American consumers suddenly had viable alternatives. The Tesla Model 3 still costs over $35,000, while a comparable BYD could have sold for under $20,000 if not for the tariffs. When the 100% duty took effect, the entire affordable EV segment practically vanished from the US market, pushing the electric dream out of reach for most Americans. Analysts called it an existential paradox. The US banned Chinese EVs to protect domestic manufacturing, but in doing so slowed down the very energy transition it had championed. Climate goals, emission-cutting pledges, all of it now faced an invisible wall. Rising prices, consumers reverting to gas cars, and domestic automakers not yet able to scale up fast enough to fill the gap. More ironic still, even as the US blocked Chinese EVs, it remained far from self-sufficient. Lithium batteries, the most expensive and critical EV component, still depended on materials sourced from Asia, much of it from China. Graphite, cobalt, manganese, all were being refined, processed, or extracted in Chinese facilities. And so, caught in this vicious cycle, the US found itself in a bind, using protectionism to preserve manufacturing, yet slowing down technological progress, blocking imports to control the supply chain, yet sinking deeper into dependency for raw materials. EVs, once hailed as the icon of the future, had become the bottleneck, the point where policy, technology, and geopolitics collided in full force. Yet if EVs are the end product of a complex production chain, then at the other end of that chain lies energy. Without electricity, batteries, or infrastructure, every EV ambition is just a paper dream. And that's where the battlefield is expanding, from car factories to oil fields, from charging stations to LNG ports. A new front is being drawn, where every barrel of oil, every cubic meter of gas, every energy supply contract becomes a trump card in a geopolitical game like the world has never seen. Energy was once a symbol of American economic might. From the oil fields of Texas to the LNG export terminals in Louisiana, the United States had over the past decade risen to become the world's largest energy exporter. But then came the political earthquake of 2025, and that balance of power began to unravel. Immediately after the first wave of trade tariffs hit, China, one of the largest buyers of US oil and gas, ordered a halt to all energy imports from America. LNG shipments were canceled, crude oil contracts frozen. Beijing quickly pivoted to suppliers less entangled in Washington's policies: Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. This wasn't just a logistical adjustment. It struck at the very foundation of the energy export model the US had built. Oil and gas companies found themselves sitting on excess inventory. Stockpiles surged, prices fell, and refineries and export terminals ran well below capacity. Thousands of workers in oil and energy logistics were placed on rotating furloughs. Some drilling contractors in Texas and Oklahoma even filed for bankruptcy within 3 months of contract suspensions. But the danger wasn't just financial loss. The deeper threat was that a new global energy order was quietly taking shape. Russia, Iran, and China, once seen as fragmented and at odds, were now deepening energy cooperation, signing long-term deals, building alternative payment systems, even setting up new transport routes through Central Asia and the Arctic. A world in which the US is pushed out of the energy negotiation table was no longer a distant scenario. It was fast becoming reality. Meanwhile, inside America, the shift toward renewable energy, which many had hoped would be the lifeline, was itself stalling due to rising costs, material shortages, and a lack of skilled labor. Offshore wind projects were postponed. Solar power plants fell behind schedule. The national grid remained outdated and too inflexible to distribute electricity efficiently. The US found itself caught in a painful limbo, unable to export fossil fuels like before, yet not ready to fully transition to green energy as planned. Barrels of crude sat idle at ports. Wind turbines stood uninstalled. And energy workers, from oil drillers to solar technicians, waited quietly for jobs to return, like waiting for rain in a long drought. And within that picture, one group bore the heaviest burden, yet remained the least talked about: the workers and small businesses at the very end of the supply chain. They had no sleek boardrooms to negotiate in, no power to influence tariffs, and no options but to wait and endure. As the world began to restructure itself, they were the ones left behind, silent but hurting, caught in a global game they were never invited to play. In the headlines, people see numbers: declining manufacturing indexes, a slight uptick in unemployment, wavering consumer confidence. But behind those numbers are quiet, aching stories. The sigh of a factory worker whose hours have been cut, yet rent still comes due. The shake of a garage owner's head when parts from Mexico are delayed indefinitely. The helpless stare of a Midwest farmer at harvest time, with no open export market left to receive his crop. The impact of a trade war doesn't stop in boardrooms, bar graphs, or GDP figures. It seeps into every corner shop, every port, every production line, every dinner table. When import tariffs drive up component costs, production expenses soar. When companies hold off on expansion or reinvestment, job demand shrinks. And when goods can't get to the right place at the right time, entire local economies begin to seize up. Consumers aren't spared from the spiral either. Food prices rise due to climbing transport and input costs. Electronics become scarce amid chip and parts shortages. Used cars are hunted down as new ones become unaffordable. Phrases like supply chain crisis, once confined to corporate reports, have become daily anxieties in ordinary life. In this environment, a new wave began to rise: patriotic consumerism. Many Americans told themselves that buying domestic was the best way to support the economy. But they quickly learned a hard truth: patriotism doesn't pay the price difference. When a made-in-USA product costs 1.5, 2, even 3 times more than its imported equivalent, national pride is often overpowered by the weight of everyday bills. And so, in the midst of these hard choices, workers, from factory floors to truck cabs to retail counters, found themselves becoming double victims. Either they kept their jobs with shrinking paychecks, or they were laid off and forced to start over from scratch. They weren't the decision makers. They didn't create the conflict. But they were the ones who bore the clearest, longest-lasting consequences. Seen from that angle, the tariff war of 2025 was no longer just a trade policy. It became a deep wound carved into the fabric of society. Every economic class, every small business chain, every household had to either adapt or be left behind. And as the dust from the tit-for-tat escalations began to settle, the final question was no longer who won or who was right, but rather, where does the world go from here? Will we rebuild a fairer, more multipolar economic order, or are we entering a new era, one of rising walls, sealed-off nations, suspicion, and mutual defensiveness? A crossroads lies ahead, and it's a story we can no longer afford to watch from the sidelines. As the smoke of the trade war begins to clear, the world is no longer the same. Ships that once bustled between continents now sit anchored in quiet anticipation. Factories that once ran 3 shifts a day now operate at a trickle, and partnerships once built on trust and integration are now strained, fractured by suspicion and protectionism. The tariff war of 2025 wasn't just a short-term shock, it was a warning, a signal that the global economic order, once grounded in the free flow of goods, capital, and technology, is entering its most severe trial since World War II. Gone is the smooth globalization of the 2010s. In its place is a fractured map, where every nation is left asking, who can we still trust? And yet, amid the chaos, green shoots are beginning to sprout. Across the globe, the conversation is shifting towards strategic autonomy. Not just about economic defense, but about rebuilding domestic production rooted in clean technology, shorter supply chains, and more sustainable values. From India to Europe, Southeast Asia to South America, governments are launching new industrial strategies, not just to compete, but to ensure they're no longer vulnerable to strategic choke points. But the road ahead won't be easy. Self-sufficiency doesn't come overnight. It demands investment, patience, and, most of all, cooperation among governments, businesses, and citizens. Without trust and long-term vision, the world risks slipping into a darker scenario, permanent fragmentation, where every nation throws up tariff walls, every region forms insular internal alliances, and global connections are severed link by link. No one ultimately will be safe. No country is big enough to do everything alone. And in that world, shortages, high prices, investment chaos, and fractured trust become the new normal. So the question now is, can this crisis become an opportunity? The answer is yes, if nations choose the path of transparent cooperation over confrontation, if they invest in real capabilities, not illusions of dominance, if consumers understand that value isn't just in the label, but in how a product is made, whether it's fair, sustainable, and respectful of people and the planet. We stand at a historic crossroads. One path leads to renewal, where the world reconnects through fairness, shared progress, and shared responsibility. The other leads to division, where everyone thinks only of themselves, building walls, and forgetting that this world has never truly been separable. History has never been written by the strongest, but by those who adapt and act at the right moment. And perhaps that moment is now. If you feel that what's happening isn't just about politics or economics, but something that will shape the future of your own life, your family's life, then don't stay silent. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the path the world should take. And if you want to keep following deep, honest, and inspiring analysis like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because only when we understand can we truly choose. And only when we choose wisely does the future really belong to us.